Hello.
Thank you.
That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marylou, for that great performance and really setting the tone for the panel.
Yeah.
So it was really great.
Very meditative and a good preparation.
Well, I'm happy you liked it.
That's very nice.
Hello, everyone out there. Welcome to our panel discussion, which is called The Sound Design and the Spectrum of Fear. I'm Colette Aliman, and Lauriane Heim is sitting over there, and we comprise of Studiocalh. And this discussion will be featuring as an introductory first episode for a podcast Lauriane and I are producing right now called Soundscapes of Fear. But first of all, thank you to TAC for hosting us and our exhibition on our research and this panel. And a big thank you for our guests today for your enthusiasm and being present. Through this introductory episode, we'll be tackling a research theme, which is the relation that sound has to the feeling of fear. Basically how sound interweaves with how we experience fear. And here we are with our guest today. Marylou, who did the great performance, is a TAC studio resident, sound designer, and performer focusing on translating ecological soundscapes into tangible and interactive experiences. Toros, Senan, on my right, is a sound designer, researcher at TUE in the Industrial Design Department, and acoustic research engineer at Sorama. His research focuses on exploring the role of sound in the design of and interaction with systems of smart things. And lastly, we have Karena Kalmbach. She holds a position in history at TUE with expertise in social and cultural history of technology and the environment, with a focus particularly on nuclear history. But Karena is not here right now, but she will be present through her recording contributions that we will play throughout the discussion. During this conversation, we will first go through the current context of fear that we're feeling today, the idea of ambiance, and then explore what we can learn about this feelings of the spectrum of fear, and when we decide to simply listen to them, what happens then.
Another synagogue shooting, another day of shock, another lonely fanatic, another cascade of insecurity and fear. I will first introduce briefly the context of this topic. When we look at the current context, we might fear. We fear economic crisis, our personal health, especially in time of a pandemic. We fear the other, with the rise of globalization, the spread of the terrorists in the opening of the border. The proliferation and the surveillance system, and also the persecution of immigrants, are the result of this panic. We feel that we are living in a fearful time, but it seems contradictory when statistics show that life expectancy is higher and it is a global phenomenon. So, are we living in a safer world? In terms of global violence, Steven Pinker made this claim. Today, we might be living in the most peaceful era in our species. But in other hands, in his article, David Brooks defined this era above all else as a time defined by fear. When we look at the global situation today, are we living in an era of fear? And maybe to start, I propose that we listen to Karena answer as an introduction.
It's a very interesting question. How do you measure fear? How do you argument based on evidence that people are more afraid than they were in previous times? So what we can definitely say is today we pay more attention to fear than we might have done in the previous decades or previous centuries. So just if you look, for instance, at the number of diagnoses of anxiety disorders, so today this is kind of considered a normal average person's illness, that psychological problems of anxiety are considered as something that is part of somebody's life. So this is not taken anymore as something extraordinary. So I think this is an interesting indication that today we, as I said, pay more attention to fear, but it doesn't necessarily say that people are more afraid than they were in previous times. So we might have just simply not had a level of attention to, be it to the illness level of anxiety, but also may not have seen it as something extraordinary, as something that needs to be treated, something that needs to be overcome. So with this, fear definitely has much more attention today and is therefore very, very present in our daily life, and a very significant emotion of our times.
So, from Karena's comment, I would like to direct the discussion to the new Marylou and ask you to develop on this idea of anxiety that she's mentioning, but toward your work, you're more focusing on the concept of eco-anxiety that you came across in your research.
Yeah. Well, eco-anxiety is like a word that became more and more popular over the last decades. It's actually, I noted, Caroline Ekman, which is a psychology lecturer at the University of Bath. She says that climate trauma has been growing over the years within Western societies for the last 40 years, actually. And today it is like experienced as anxiety, which is coming to the surface. And actually today it impacts more and more young people, and even therapists said that children are terrified about the climate catastrophe. So, but the thing is, actually, this trauma is making the situation a bit worse in a way that it becomes an important obstacle in the willing to take action. So it's like the human psyche is functioning to disconnect from information or experience that are disturbing or overwhelming. So it's like, especially if we feel powerless in making change. So like with reason not to know, otherwise it creates a very stressing experience. So actually it creates like a psychological dilemma in a way that creates existential consequences. Like the most extreme one that we know is like a complete denial of climate change. And the more common one that we can have, that most of us can have actually, is just micro denial, but it's already enough to to create this obstacle I'm talking about, like this block the ability to take action. So if I can just say like a positive point about that, is like I saw that in the work of Ekman, she works to take, she's taking mental health into account to create solution in a way that creating some psychological training for not lecturers but campaigners who needs to get their message across without like triggering the shut down behavior in people. So in a way, it's like into acknowledging the feeling and the discomfort of the situation, and also learn to take a certain responsibility. So it's more like emotionally respond to the reality. That's what I can say about that.
Thank you, very well developed. Then now we'll go to you, Toros. Based on your psychoacoustic studies research, what would be your opinion regarding this question?
Based on my research, I have no opinion, because I actually didn't work in fear.
Okay. Yeah.
I actually didn't work in soundscape, or at least my research wouldn't fit in soundscape research.
Okay.
As a non-expert, I have some ideas, but
Great.
I think I tend to agree with both statements, because when I think about it, we are now the species as humans who are kind of in charge in our living environments. Huh? So 80,000 years ago, I guess people have different daily or momentary fears, like are you going to make it to your cave tonight, or are you going to be eaten? So that is a different type of anxiety environment than what we have now. And here, in this moment, for example, some person can travel to, well, not in this moment, but pre-pandemic environment, some person can travel to some area, transport there, observe something, decide that something is wrong, and then there are tools to analyze and measure that, and then understand that the Earth is warming up, ice is melting, something is not going well, and we can predict that something is going bad. So this is now an area that we can actually reduce the uncontrolled or uncontrollable situations. So theoretically, we should be less afraid, because there's less surprises. I mean, if we really pull our shit together, it should be fine.
But also the ice melting is a material that you can measure. And in this case, theoretically, then we cannot really say or measure fear, because we have no clue how to.
Yeah, so it is not really possible to relate it with the measure of fear, but what I was saying is, when considered years and years ago, being able to measure this and predict that something bad is coming to the future of Earth was not possible. So now actually we know it, so we can actually stop it. So we should be less afraid, I feel like. But apparently it's not the case.
But maybe media is gearing it to finding this kind of data, that we have access to this kind of data, this kind of material visualization of how the Earth is changing.
Yeah.
That it's making this kind of, instead of being positive and thinking of it as, okay, we can do something now, it's more, oh my God, let's wrap this with anxiety a bit. But again, maybe that is also a way a technique of pushing people to do something. So I guess it's just how we respond.
Yeah, I also feel like, for example, I mean, first, let's assume, I really am not an ecologist or evolutionary psychologist or anything like that, but let's assume after one point we are in charge of the world, and then it becomes that we don't now fight with huge sizes of tigers, but we fight with the other human. And then right now we come to a level that we can communicate fast, so it is actually possible to not fight, right? And we have this technology that is pretty much new, if you look in a broader sense, like storing an audio and visual data from a certain moment in life, and then transferring it to somewhere else, and then playing it back to some other person who didn't experience that moment, like a TV, or doesn't have to be a smartphone or anything. And after that, people now who did not experience traumatic events are now watching it. And I read, because I did a quick lookup of how you define fear, and apparently you don't only learn fear by experience, but you also learn fear by watching it. So I tend to feel now that it is possible that we are developing a common soundscape of fear. But that is, I think, only possible nowadays. I don't think it was, I don't think it, me, I'm Turkish, I live in Netherlands now, and I have some sort of soundscape history in my life that is associated with some traumatic events. I don't think that fits very well with everyone in my age in different parts of the world, but maybe now, maybe it is possible.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Toros. So it's really hard to answer this question if we are experiencing more fear than before, but maybe what we can say is that the amount of violence that we are facing through mass media has increased, and then it has also blunted our sensibilities. And I think Karena brings a good sum up to that. To wrap up this one.
Yeah, what we can say that we definitely have a very high attention to fear settings in now the Heims. It remains open the question if previous generations or people living in previous centuries were really less afraid than we are today. I think this is a very difficult thing to identify, and the history of emotion is a research field that has tried to grasp these emotional settings. But at the same time, yes, we have a high attention on fear settings and where these fears are originating from. There we find most various theories and hypotheses, if this now has to do with secularization, if it has to do with the increase of mass media, or now in more current times, digital social media, or if it's particular technologies that trigger the fear, or if it's more on a level of broader social dynamics, like the increase in uncertainty and risk in general. So there are most various strands of social science theorizing where these fears that we are dealing today actually stem from. And I think this is a very more interesting question to look at. How are we perpetuating these fears, and how are we come to develop new fears than asking if people today are more afraid than they were in previous times.
Does anybody want to comment on that one? That was just fantastic. So yeah, I'll move on to the next section of our panel discussion. In the hierarchy of our senses, we attempt to place vision as a main one. Our vocabulary is showing it, we read a room. But on the other hand, how can we feel and describe an ambiance by using a different approach? So I'd like to read this quote. When we try to describe an ambiance, or even to define the very notion of ambiance, we tend to use various terms derived from the science of acoustics or music, terms that are rooted in the verbal history of auditory experience. An ambiance can be specified by its tone. It involves our ability to be in tune with the space. According to Jean-Paul Thibault, spaces provide numerous ambiances to be felt with all the senses. The main argument is to consider sound as a particular efficient medium to investigate and develop an account of urban ambiances. When we're processing an environment, it is all our sensory experiences that layer on together, and that helps us piece together a certain ambiance that we internally feel. So, taking from this statement, in general, what would be the value of focusing on sound as a primary sensory input? And then I would like to direct a question to you, Toros. Can you go back into the field of psychoacoustics from sonic sensory input, and maybe talk about your experience with designed objects that influence the sonic ambiance of a space?
Yeah, another difficult question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's almost, it is for me, it is not really possible to answer what would be if the auditory modality would be the primary input. I think it is really unanswerable, because that requires some sort of comparative analysis, and then you can only go back to the blind people maybe, to learn from them, but then comparing their experiences with a non-blind person is not really valid. But what we can focus on then would be complex soundscapes where people are doing hard works, let's say difficult stuff like airplane pilots, for example. They have all these buttons, all these visual stuff all over them, and they all deliver some important information, and that person has to be mentally in shape while processing all of that and be very flexible in terms of acting immediately when something goes wrong. When you have that many visual input, then you have to start giving information in another modality. And you have to use another, like sound, because then visual modality gets into this bottleneck moment. And that way you can actually open another affordances level. So then people can actually receive that. And this is being used. So when I think of this question in terms of an applied context, it's obvious that sound is not used as much as visuals, but it can be used. And it is people who figured that out are using that pretty dominantly in every kind of alarm systems, for example. You use that. And we are kind of more, we are better at figuring out time-related events with our ears when compared to our visuals. We have a higher resolution. So with tempo-related events, we are better at listening them and figuring out if something is wrong. So there are some advantages to use that. I think, but I think we are getting there in general. That's my feeling.
It's becoming more of a common practice.
Yeah, because visual modality is occupied a lot now. Because like everybody is like this all the time. I mean, how much can you do like this? When you show them another, I don't know, some sign in the road, that person doesn't see that, basically. You need to let that person hear that. So, yeah.
The shouting is a very efficient way.
Yeah, shouting is good.
I could definitely like picture this dystopian exponentialized version of this, but I won't go there. But
Well,
yeah.
if I can continue,
Sure.
like, because
Yeah.
on another level, like if you take the example of nature sound, it can really resonate with your example, like with the example of the silent springs that we're experiencing more and more every year, because we have lost around 40% of the birds in Europe, and I think, if I remember well, 14% of the world's birds are now on the list of extinctions, and I'm only taking things example of the birds, but every animal that make sounds are also declining, a large number of them, and it affects a lot the soundscape. But what I wanted to say is, like, people in general started to notice these changes for their year, because this number, the biodiversity number, is not something that the large public are very on a daily basis aware of. It's only about percentage, it's only about number. But when they start noticing that the springs sounds were different, it was actually changing the this hierarchy of senses that we have since many years, putting the vision on the top of it. And it's like the sense of hearing was actually helping people to notice that something was missing on their view, on an image. And like, actually, if you really think about if nature sound has a function, it has a huge one, because every animal has a very specific sound frequency that they own, and like they own a very a range that they can use at their territory to use their own language to attract a mate, and or like to just forgot the word, just to prevent an attack, for example, or just to protect themselves.
Defense.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, nature sound can be actually a huge and very precise indicator of the environment changes, and actually then the consequences of climate change, with noticing how much a bird has been growing or declining on a certain territory, or how they could adapt to a certain sound pollution or other changes in the environment, like using of pesticides or using of intensive agriculture. So it's like, yeah, nature sound can like offer another reading of very sensitive of the environment, while they can like be very precise in their language.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And then we had this other recording from Karena. That's quite nice. That actually focuses on where our panel is right now in Eindhoven, and what is one of the main sensory inputs that everyone experiences here.
Sound is, we look at it more in a long-term perspective, it has a more of a warning signal than the visualization. So to shout out when you want to warn somebody of a threat is something very much more efficient. And so we find this very basic warning signal when it comes to alarms. So I find it very interesting arriving in the Netherlands and to hear these monthly alarm sirens on tests. I think it's every Wednesday at 12, first Wednesday of the month. So I found this extremely interesting to have that as part of daily life, to be trained to read these signals, trained on the one hand to accept them in your daily life, to be remembered that every minute or every second is siren going on, and that you know directly what it means. So that it has, on the one hand, this normalizing aspect to accept in your living environment that there might be a major threat coming at you every possible moment. But at the same time, that it also normalizes or reminds us of this warning thing, of this way of being alarmed. Maybe work on a more subtle level, and that we maybe also therefore be less aware of what sounds make us afraid than we are aware of what exposure to visual objects might make us afraid.
Yeah, so now we see that generating a spectrum of alarm on the spectrum of fear, we can use sound design by intertwining this with how we perceive our environment. And it has been accustomed and accepted as a normal part of our everyday. For example, with what Karena is saying, the alarm systems, and how they are introduced to calibrate the public's anxiety and probably designed to modulate our fear levels. But on the opposite, the loss of sound can be also extremely alarming. Silence, as we also experienced during our past months, during the pandemic, if you live in an urban situation, the silence can be terrifying. And so what would you say, Marylou, about this kind of silence, but taken out of the urban context and into the ecological silence?
Well, it's really reflect the disappearance of slowly of, like as I said before, our environment in general, and the sound that we were used to, even us, like when we were young, like the typical sound we were listening in a very specific moment of the year that also makes our memories and our knowledge about our environment are nowadays missing, and that creates also a kind of anxiety and eco-anxiety. It's part of the not symptoms, but it causes symptoms also. Mm-hmm. And forgot what I want to say, but I think actually during the pandemic something happened which we might have all heard about, that like nature came back in cities and birds start singing again because we are doing less sound pollution, because of sound pollution in city, birds are adapting themselves to sing in another time, or they just not sing at all. Like for example, the blackbird, the P in French, but it's a blackbird in English, I believe. He trained himself to sing around like 2 or 3 in the morning, while normally it should sing when the sun is rising, but because of sound pollution and the car starting earlier to make noise, he had to change his habits. I'm kind of crazy, but I kind of really want to talk about it, but in a way that nature just, when humans are like doing less pollution, less noise, less activity, it's also a very big resilience, which is also reassuring in this anxious silence that we're experiencing, not in a pandemic.
Thank you. Yeah. We're told all to speak a bit louder.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry?
You have to speak a bit
For
louder.
everyone here, we're told to speak a bit louder.
Oh, okay.
Just so everyone knows. Yeah, we can go to the next part. Yeah.
So, going to the third and last question, to explore this relation between fear and sound, fear here can be also used as a potential tool for political agenda and mass manipulation. The designing of buildings, space, image, media interfaces can serve this specific purpose. In a time of crisis, television was once again providing a perceptual focal point for the spontaneous mass coordination of affect. Television has become the event medium. So, based on Brian Massumi's statement, through TV channel, governments use television in a way that it gives the exercise of power in a perceptual mode of operation. So not only image expressed the threat or violence, and to go back also to what Karena said earlier, sounds can be also highly expressive and follow and support this parameter. So the question that we asked is, what can the spectrum of fear underpin when we look at it from an auditory perspective? And then I direct this question to also you, Toros, based on your experience working at Sorama, a company that offers safety monitoring through technological innovation with sound camera in Eindhoven. Maybe could you explain further how sound is a unique way to observe and maybe can be used as a preventive tool in monitoring or guiding?
Yeah, thanks. So it is not directly related with fear per se, but more like safety. So if you interpret that in a way, fear comes with an arousal in a certain part of the evoking the emotion, then it is related with fear in that sense. In Sorama we have these microphone arrays. So it is with one microphone you can measure certain things. With more than one microphone you can actually understand where the sound is coming from. It is not possible with one microphone. And we have more than two and more than a lot of microphones that are typically installed in a certain box kind of shape, where we actually position it to an area, to a predetermined area, and continuously listen to the soundscape of the area. In this particular application you mentioned, that is in Stratum Sign and Stripe, we work with a company called Sound Intelligence, and what they do is we listen to the area, and that sound is getting into their algorithms, and then their algorithms decide whether that soundscape consists of a gunshot sound or a breaking glass sound or an angry sound. And if there is a sound, according to their algorithms, that fits with this explanation, they trigger an event, and we can see the position of that event in a map. Okay. So it helps police or who are in charge of security to come there to either stop it, but hopefully they come a little bit early, so their algorithms are tweaked in that way to prevent anything becoming worse. So from one aspect, you can think of it like if people know this, it exists there, they would probably feel a bit more comfortable. I don't know. They would feel less fear. So it is possible to use sound in terms of safety technology in this sense. But in a way, in this particular example, the attempt is to characterize the sound based on certain type of events that create some harm. But they are not the fear itself. The fear comes as a result of those events. Like a gunshot by itself is not directly a fear sound.
Yeah.
What happens around it is the fear. So
Presentation that it creates,
But yeah, it is pretty possible to create an, let's say, to act immediately, let's put it that way. Maybe you cannot create complete safety everywhere in the world, but it is possible to assess the safety of the soundscape using the sound. Yeah.
That's interesting because it goes also to the next answer from Karena, that is paralleling technological growth and the spectrum of fear. So we could listen to it.
What technologies have we become to accept in our everyday life because of our fears? So take, for instance, surveillance technology. I mean, if there would not be a particular fear in yourself that somebody might break into your house, why would you ever have the idea to put a video camera in front of your entrance? So there's fear, so that's a very, very concrete driving force of embracing or developing this technology. But fear of major environmental disasters have triggered all kinds of technologies and infrastructures and very much shape our social technical systems of today's time. So with this, I think we have incorporated in our very design of technologies our fears that we developed throughout the 20th century. So fear as a driving force for the development of technologies and the implementation of new technologies. That then, in the next step, might well trigger new fears. So now, look at again the surveillance technology. So now we have the next level of being afraid of being monitored all the time. I mean, we would not have this fear if this technology would not exist. Very true so. But at the same time, we would not have the technology if we would not have it, developed it because of certain prevailing fears.
Yeah, so as she perfectly said, you fear something, you create a product to stop it, but then you discover that you created a new fear because you don't want to be monitored. And then you create another product that stop that, and then it goes into this repetitive pattern of creation of objects that stops and start again in a way, that common feeling. Then to counter this, Marylou, I think you could add some comment on that. In the opposite, what other technique of sonic observation could be proposed in order to also reduce this anxiety or even fear?
Well, first of all, it is known that, well, I'm working with nature sounds, obviously, so I'm not going to talk with that.
Which is already a lot. Really
but it's also known in a biological point of view that it's trigger the right hormones, which is dopamine, endorphin, serotonin, and melatonin to calm anxiety, which are like the basic hormones to calm anxiety. But the thing is that in my work, I'm actually trying to make people regain control on what they listen, because actually from our alienation from nature that we experience with the Anthropocene, we are more and more disconnected from nature with living in urban environment, and it's like what result is a kind of misreading or like mislistening of the natural world, like as we can be surprised when the silence arrived, when it was slowly actually arriving, for example. So it's like also this like hearing loss, this feeling, this global stress, because if we can't understand it, what we listen, it's just happening as an anxiety trigger again. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like if I can just talk about my own approach, I felt that people had to maybe it's more about the time, actually. Because of overspeed, we don't take the time to listen. It's a very contemplative behavior. It's not something that we really promote today. It's more about like being efficient and being fast, and everything that doesn't have really a goal or something to gain from is not really, we don't have the time to do that anymore. So yeah, listening to nature is a complete different timeline from like listening to music. For example, nature takes its own time to just grow, to make its own music. It's a real orchestra. If nature is not polluted by any trigger or any pollution, it can be really rhythmical, really melodic, and that's the theory of Bernie-Krause, which talk about that. So yeah, in my way, I'm trying to build device and mediation devices to make people play with instrument, like what I build here, like making music with nature sounds, like being maestro, like being like in control again, because we're losing control over our behavior to nature. It's becoming too big, so it's just a small approach, but then you just focus on what you're listening, and then also you change your overspeed behavior, and that's already helping to reconnect and just like reduce an anxiety with the sense of hearing.
The sense of hearing.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Just thinking about the orchestra of nature and how we're part of nature, I just want to, it's a bit of a quirky question to you, Toros, about your time at Sorama. Because you've been there for a while, right? And yeah. So the city is kind of like orchestra itself, I would say. And then, so when you're producing these sonic cameras, how would you call them again?
Sound camera.
Sound cameras, yeah. And then we're trying to listen to the orchestra of the city, but you're using an algorithm to specify certain, let's say, if an instrument was an event that would happen in the city, then you have to specify what instrument that is connected to an event.
Yeah.
Yeah. What, during the process of working on, like, in such a company, like, does it ever get to the point where all the sounds kind of sound the same, or is it like really, like, was there like a meta moment?
Yeah, well, firstly, in the previous example I made,
Yeah.
so we are not the ones who are actually deciding what sound becomes an event.
Yeah.
So in that application, we are not the ones who are making that. We are not the ones who are listening to the sound per se. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
So from based on that, I cannot really say anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, in Sorama, we actually work quite in a different frequency ranges. So it's also possible that I work with sounds that are not audible by humans.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it can be. But in my PhD, I worked in psychoacoustics.
Okay,
That makes it for sure that I should be able to hear that. Yeah. So and it is very common in psychoacoustics that you build these sounds, synthesize these sounds to use in an experiment, which should be synthesized in a way that it should eliminate all the changes that you don't want to investigate in a sound. So it becomes very bad. It becomes like this noise pulses. They do this or sine tones like and this is the all variation, and you ask people certain questions while presenting those sounds, and then they have to answer it, and then you have your data. And while preparing for one experiment, it practically means for the experimenter that you listen to that sound for a very, 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 very long time,
Yeah.
which you don't want to listen to that.
Okay.
Does it work?
Does it change?
Yeah, I have a different approach of listening my environment. That
Okay,
is true,
yeah.
because I used to be listening in a more musical way, like she was explaining. Now I'm more thinking about changes in time and frequency domain and the combination of sine tones.
Do you want to train yourself back to a more...
No, this is a different type of communication. Huh?
Okay, yeah.
I mean, it's not bad.
Yeah.
It's just not aesthetically pleasing. Yeah, let's put it that way.
Okay.
But it is a different communication with your surroundings and understand, because essentially these are microphones. Huh?
Yeah.
This takes data, converts it in a weird electrical signals, and then it sends it to your brain, and then your brain gets those data, puts it together, and then you say, oh, I heard it. And everything in between should be investigated with these kind of bad sounds, because you cannot really cut someone's brain while they're alive. So that is the way you learn how your hearing works with your surroundings. So I'm okay.
You're okay with it. Very good. Yeah, very good, very good. So we're going to move our panel to the conclusion part. And so we'd like to play our last recording contribution from Karena. where she talks about how she sums up how sounds that interweave with our emotions in the spectrum of fear can be positive or considered what you would say negative influences of our experience of our lives.
With this question of fear as a potential tool, we are multi-level relationship between fear and to technologies. To see fear not as only something that we try to avoid and overcome, but it's definitely also an emotion that we proactively seek. So just the popularity of horror movies, or also many video games that are designed, also in their sound design, in a way to trigger fear in the gamer. So as I said, not only an emotion that we try to overcome, but and I think this could be an interesting thing to investigate. If maybe with the modern era is not only a time where we pay more attention to fear, but maybe also a time where we have started to proactively seek fears, because maybe we do not find enough fears in our daily life, but there is such a high attention on fears, we do not only avoid them, but also have to conceptualize them as positive and negative fears. These two different kind of fears are then transferred maybe in sound design. How kind of soundscapes, what kind of sound landscapes are we creating around different kinds of fears that we either want to evoke or that we want to calm down. So speaking of the spectrum of fears, I think there goes the whole spectrum of sound with these different fears. So if it's a provoking fear or calming fear, and if this is meant in a vitalizing or in a calming way.
So that was our last recording from Karena. So thank you, Karena. So to conclude this whole talk, we've been through a lot of twists and turns, and not focusing on fear, and yes, focusing on fear, but mostly just figuring out how do we listen to or understand how we perceive our lives through sound, and how we relate to other species or other places through sound. We tackled the possibilities, the contradictions that we are living in a more fearful era, and if there is actually a rise of anxiety now, or did we not understand or have a place for anxiety in our lives like hundreds of years ago?
And is it happening through then mass media representation?
Yep.
Or is it a fear that is then perpetuating from a place to another, also through different channels?
Yeah, but then also acknowledging how these fears or these sounds can just be uncomfortable, and if we want to respond to them or not. And we also have like different kinds of fear, and how like different kinds of fear soundscapes, either positive or negative. And then we went into Jean Thibault's theories of ambiance through sound, and how this is very relevant because of the tone and tuning into a space and just trying to see how this space reverberates within you. And then going into what is the ambiance of an event when we are able to experience it through sonic cues and just in general. And then we went into how this manipulation of sonic production of certain kind of fears can create new fears through Karena's recordings. And then also, how do we interact with these sounds of fear, and what is the difference of pursuing it or avoiding it in general? But also about taking the time just to hear our environment, and not, let's say, observing it as negative or positive fear sounds within it, but maybe different ways to psychoacoustically hear your environment because of your experiences with working with sound, or such things like that, that there is a possibility to recalibrate your associations to the world around you. And even though it might not be aesthetic, it can still be
Possible.
another way to just live
Alternative.
in our soundscapes. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
You said it well.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for Karena, you're out there, for your recordings. Thank you, Lauriane, Toros, and Marylou for contributing to this panel with your great insights. Again, this presentation would not be possible without TAC, so thank you guys, everyone here with the crew. Also, without the guidance of the Talent Development Program at Format at Z33 Art Museum in Belgium, our collaborations, research, and the growth of this podcast platform would not be possible at all. We are also thankful to the Creative Industry Funds for their sponsorship of the development of our episodes and our installation that will be at the Format exhibition next year in February at Z33. So if anybody is in Eindhoven, if you're around, please come by and see our installation, Soundscapes of Fear, at What a Time to Be Alive at TAC. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yay. And we can play something.